Extension will give more time to continue talks dealing with trade imbalances and what they consider unfair trade practices. Meantime, this morning, China has announced a preliminary anti-dumping duty on Canadian canola imports.
The U.S. and China were at a very different rate. If you think back to April, we were talking about 145% tariffs imposed by the U.S. on Chinese goods, China responding with 125% tariffs. That was so high, it was essential.
When it comes to global trade in 2025, President Donald Trump is once again at the center of attention. Just as markets braced for another round of tariff hikes between the U.S. and China, Trump signed an executive order extending the trade truce for 90 more days. Beijing followed suit, which means Washington's tariffs on Chinese imports stay at 30%, and China's duties on U.S. goods remain at 10%. On the surface, this sounds like a cooling of tensions. But at the same moment, China struck back somewhere else, this time against Canada. Beijing announced a preliminary anti-dumping duty of 76% on Canadian canola seed, starting this week. For Canada, this is devastating. Canola is a cornerstone crop, with around 40,000 farmers depending on it. China has been their biggest buyer, importing about $5 billion worth every year, and most of that, $4 billion, is raw seed. With duties this high, China is essentially shutting the door. Why target Canada now? The reason is tied directly to Trump's trade agenda. Over the past year, Canada aligned itself with U.S. policies by placing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum. Ottawa's goal was to stay in step with Washington, but Beijing sees this as Canada taking sides in Trump's trade war. So instead of hitting the U.S. directly, China chose to punish an American ally, showing it can raise the cost for those who follow Trump's lead. For Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, the fallout is immediate. Tens of thousands of prairie farmers face losing their largest customer. Worse, once China shifts to other suppliers like Australia, Ukraine, or Russia, those markets may never return to Canada. Carney now faces a painful dilemma: stand firmly with Trump and risk deeper retaliation from China, or try to ease tensions with Beijing and risk being accused of disloyalty to Washington. Meanwhile, Trump's priorities are different. By extending the truce with China, he avoids a repeat of the tariff escalation that nearly spiraled out of control last year. At that time, the U.S. imposed duties as high as 145%, and China retaliated with 195%. It was, in effect, a trade embargo. The result was rising costs for American businesses, higher consumer prices, and major supply chain disruptions. Trump cannot afford to let that happen again, especially heading into an election cycle. So this 90-day pause is strategic. It allows Trump to maintain his tough image at home, pointing to a $111 billion trade deficit with China so far this year, and insisting he is fighting back, while also preventing a full-scale economic shock that could trigger inflation and job losses. In short, he is buying time. But here's the catch. The price of that breathing room is not being paid in Washington. It's being paid in Ottawa. By striking at Canada's canola sector instead of escalating against the U.S., China is sending two messages. First, it can retaliate in ways that don't directly provoke Trump, but still cause real pain. Second, America's allies should think twice about lining up behind Trump's trade crusade, because they may be the ones who get hit hardest. The risks look very different depending on where you sit. For the U.S., the concern is the overall economy. Higher tariffs on China could mean inflation across many sectors, from electronics to clothing to household goods. For Canada, the impact is narrower but more brutal. An entire farming industry is suddenly at risk of collapse. This exposes the uncomfortable truth about Trump's America First approach. His focus is on protecting American voters from immediate economic damage, not on shielding allies from retaliation. For Trump, the truce is a domestic political win. For Carney, it's a strategic nightmare. Canada followed Washington's lead, and now Canadian farmers are left to pay the price. The bigger lesson is clear. In trade wars, the smaller partner often gets hit first. China knows that attacking the U.S. head-on could trigger another tariff explosion that damages both economies. Instead, Beijing is cutting into Canada's most vulnerable sector to show that Trump's coalition of allies is fragile. So where does that leave us? Trump has succeeded for now in containing the immediate threat of a U.S.-China tariff spiral. He can claim progress at home, pointing to the pause as proof of his negotiating power, but Canada is discovering the cost of standing beside the U.S. in this trade conflict. Its canola industry, worth billions and supporting tens of thousands of livelihoods, now faces the prospect of losing its largest customer, possibly for good. Trump may view the truce as a victory, but Canada's crisis shows that the real story is more complicated. The U.S. president is protecting his own economy from another shock, while his allies absorb the blow. And that sets the stage for part 2 of our analysis, where we look at Canada's strategic dilemma, Carney's options, and the broader question of whether Trump's America First agenda is leaving Washington increasingly isolated.
In China, and this is going to leave canola farmers in the middle because, while we had seen tariffs or anti-dumping duties in place on canola meal and canola oil since March, the U.S. and China were at a very different rate. If you think back to April, we were talking about 145% tariffs imposed by the U.S. on Chinese goods, China responding with 125% tariffs.
Canada today finds itself trapped between two global powers. After China imposed a 76% duty on Canadian canola seed, one of the country's most important farm exports, a $5 billion industry, was thrown into crisis. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, this is not only an agricultural challenge, it is a test of how Canada can survive in a world where Donald Trump drives U.S. trade policy with an America First mindset, and where China retaliates by targeting America's closest allies. Canada's dilemma. On one side, Canada relies deeply on the United States, not only for trade but also for its overall security. Breaking away from Washington is impossible. On the other side, aligning too closely with Trump now comes at a high cost. Around 40,000 farmers across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta risk losing their biggest buyer almost overnight. China used to purchase about $5 billion of Canadian canola each year, $4 billion of that in raw seed. With the new duty, Beijing is effectively telling Canada, find another market because we don't need your canola anymore. Carney is cornered. If he tries to repair relations with Beijing, Trump may see it as disloyalty. If he stays firmly with Washington, Canadian farmers remain exposed to further retaliation. Either choice carries risks. Trump's view of alliances. From Trump's perspective, the calculation is simple. Protect American industries and American voters first. When he extended the trade truce with China, his focus was on preventing price spikes for U.S. consumers and showing he was addressing a $111 billion trade deficit. Canada's canola farmers were not part of that equation. This reveals Trump's broader approach. He treats alliances like business deals. If America benefits, the deal works. If allies take losses, that is their responsibility. For Ottawa, this means Canada can no longer assume the U.S. will step in when allies suffer in trade conflicts. Ripple effects on global markets. China's move does not reduce its demand for canola. It simply shifts purchases to other suppliers. Countries like Australia, Ukraine, and Russia are eager to fill the gap. Once those supply chains are established, they are difficult to reverse. For Canada, the damage could last for years, not months. This reshuffling also sends a message beyond Canada. If supporting Trump makes allies vulnerable to retaliation, others may hesitate to follow Washington's lead in future disputes. America First may reduce the U.S. trade deficit, but it risks leaving Washington more isolated on the global stage. Carney's search for independence. Carney has already hinted at a shift in thinking. In a recent speech on defense, he argued that Canada must spend more on its own military and build stronger ties with Europe. A similar logic now applies to trade. If the U.S. cannot protect Canada from the fallout of its tariff battles, Ottawa will have to look for new partners, whether in Europe, Japan, India, or other regions. This does not mean breaking ties with Washington. The U.S. will always be Canada's largest partner. But it does mean diversifying so that one political decision in the White House does not leave Canadian farmers exposed. Ironically, Trump's tough policies may be the very force pushing Canada to become more independent. The bigger picture. For Trump, the main stage is still the U.S.-China relationship. The stakes are enormous: inflation, jobs, and America's global credibility. But China has shown it doesn't need to confront Trump head-on. By striking at Canada, Beijing proves it can pressure America's allies and reveal the limits of Trump's ability to shield them. The contrast is clear. Trump claims success at home. He prevented a new round of tariff hikes and shielded American consumers from higher prices. Carney, by contrast, faces political backlash at home as farmers demand answers. One leader avoids the pain while the other absorbs it. That imbalance cannot last forever. Conclusion: America first, allies second. So where does this leave Canada, trapped between loyalty to Washington and survival in global markets? Carney cannot abandon the U.S., but he also cannot ignore the collapse of one of Canada's most valuable export industries. Trump, meanwhile, has once again shown that America first means exactly that. If allies are hurt in the process, they are expected to handle it alone. For Canada, the costs are already real. Billions in lost sales, tens of thousands of farmers at risk, and long-term uncertainty about its role in global trade. The lesson is sobering. Trade wars do not only pit great powers against each other. They ripple outward, forcing smaller countries to make impossible choices. China's strike on Canadian canola proves that Trump's strategy doesn't just strain ties with rivals, it leaves America's closest partners exposed. The big question is whether Trump can keep balancing tensions with China while leaving allies like Canada unprotected. Or will the cost of America first eventually push even the closest U.S. partners to look for new paths of their own? That is the challenge ahead, for Carney, for Canada, and for Trump himself.